People the color of the very night, working briskly and moaning at the same time without a moment of peace or rest. Whoever sees all the confused and noisy machinery will say that this indeed is the image of hell, remarked a Brazilian visitor observing the reality of sugar plantations. As the saying goes, sugar, spice, and everything nice, the effect of sugar was anything but nice in America. However, sugar was important for America because it increased the demand for slave labor, it sparked new culture within America, and it led to strain between the American colonies and Britain. Sugar cane was first planted in New Guinea around 9000 to 8000 BC. Sugar then spread to Asia's mainland, to southern China and southeast India. When Europe was introduced to sugar during the Christian Crusades, they learned how to plant and refine sugar from the Muslims. Using these new skills, they began farming on fertile lands, which were mostly located on flat land near coastal waters. During Christopher Columbus's second exploration of the Americas in 1493, he brought over sugarcane from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean island. Hispaniola, or now Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, was first introduced to sugar in the 1500s, but its production quickly spread across the island. Slave trade was common in America, but sugar evoked a boost for mass slave labor. The peak production of sugar in the Americas lasted from the 1600s to the 1800s. This is when the Age of Sugar began, which economically linked Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas together. This played a part in the triangular trade, a trading system with America, Europe, and Africa. The triangular trade increased the need for slaves as sugar became a valuable cash crop due to Europe's high demand for sugar. Starting from the 1750s, sugar transformed England's food and drinks into a necessity, even for the poor. In 1753, an average of 34,250 African slaves were taken every year, but by 1768, it increased to 53,100 slaves per year. Many of these Africans were sent either to the Caribbean or South America so they could start their brutal labor. However, despite the labor's harshness, the Middle Passage was also torture for the slaves on board. For instance, slaves were overpacked onto ships, the death rate was high due to disease, suffocation, starvation, beatings, and suicide, and African women were raped and abused. Once slaves arrived at the sugar plantations, they started their work right away. Overseers, or watchmen over the slaves on the plantation, would constantly monitor slaves to make sure they never stopped working or to make sure they weren't working too slowly. Slaves were expected to work on the plantation until they died, but the life expectancy for them was only 7 years or less. Because of this, the demand for slaves increased greatly, so that more slaves could replace the ones that were dying rapidly. The whole system would collapse without enough people constantly working. Muslims created the first sugar plantations, which focused on the process of growing, grounding, boiling, and drying the sugar. The problem with the system was that it required a mass amount of workers that worked constantly, in sync, in order for it to succeed. Another problem with running these plantations was that there wasn't enough wood to keep the vat with sugar boiling. Both the Muslims and Christians tested out this system by using their slaves on plantations that were usually in the Mediterranean. There were many jobs that went into the plantation, and most of them were dangerous, laborious, and brutal. Some would dig holes for the cane shoots. If the terrain wasn't too rough, groups of slaves would take oxen to plow the fields. But if the terrain was rockier, slaves would have to precisely dig enough space for each cane shoot to go in. They weren't allowed to stop working, and the slaves often had to dig a certain number of holes in an hour, or else they would be beaten. Others helped with the seeding and weeding. The seeders would then push the cane cuttings into the holes and cover them with soil. However, weeding was some of the worst labor because it required the weeders to spend up to 14 hours a day digging away the undergrowth of the cane stalks so that it wouldn't stunt their growth. Not only did the weeders have to deal with the sharp leaves of the stalks, but they also had an abundance of rats constantly scampering around them. After that was cutting and carting the wood. Groups of slaves had to cut wood while others wheeled the timber back to the boiling house in order to heat up the boiling vats. Next, slaves cut and bundled the sugar cane. Slaves were given machetes to cut down the cane while the women would collect them and bundle them up. This was an important job because the workers needed to pace themselves perfectly so that they had enough cane to feed the wheel meals while not cutting too much cane so that it wouldn't dry up before it was ground. There was also the job of feeding the cane into the ever-turning mill wheels. This job was especially dangerous because it had women constantly feeding cane into these powerful grinders. However, since the mill wheels never stopped, women were always sleep deprived, which often led to extreme or deadly accidents. This is because if a woman's arm went too far while feeding in the cane, she would be pulled into the grinders. To solve this, an axe was kept nearby, so that if someone got caught in the grinders, their arm could be hacked off before they were pulled in. An essential job was being the boiler. A boiler was a highly skilled slave that had the job of managing the boiling liquid that would eventually be turned into grains of sugar. His main job was to evaluate when to strike, which meant deciding when to take the liquid off the fire, allowing it to cool. The boiler had to know everything about this liquid, such as its appearance and smell, so he could precisely tell when it was done boiling. Lastly, there was separating the pure sugar from the less valuable sugar. The final step of this process was for women known as the mothers of the platform. As proof of the horrors on these plantations, On Sugar was a poem that originated from the Tyler family papers. Its contents contain themes that describe the price for sugar being paid with the slave's blood. It reads, "Go guilty, thou seducing food, purchased by many a brother's blood. To me thou speaks of dying groans, of mangled limbs, of fruitless moans. To me thy tempting white appears, steeped in 1,000 negroes' tears. I see the lash uplifted high, I see the vainly asking eye, the shrunk clasped hands that but provoke their tyrants to a harder stroke. The varied punishments I view, invention blackest pencil drew, and did to cruel man impart, for what? To pierce a brother's heart. And can I then a sweet enjoy that tempts me only to destroy? No, I abhor the tempting food purchased by many a brother's blood. I'll wage with habit virtuous strife to save a fellow creature's life, and bless the day I scorned of food purchased by many a brother's blood." Sugar also sparked a new culture. Despite being under constant hard labor, African slaves still managed to spark a new culture within the sugar plantations. Music and dance was a huge contributor to this. Today, slave music is usually grouped into 3 major categories: religious, work, and recreational songs. European and African musical traditions both shaped the development of a wide range of music today, including gospel, jazz, and blues. The banjo was an instrument that was often played while being accompanied by singing. The banjo is a good example of African culture being brought over to America since it originated in Senegambia, located in West Africa. It sparked a new culture since it was able to combine, quote-unquote, the rhythmic nature of African music and the melodic sounds of European music. Music and dance allowed them to express themselves and to carry on their memory throughout the generations so that they didn't become another forgotten number. Dances such as the bamba, which sugar workers invented, signified that slaves weren't just workers, but living and feeling beings. These acts of expression would sometimes inspire rebellions, or it would convince slaves to run away from the sugar plantations. African slaves made a new culture by mixing aspects of African religions and American religions together. For instance, they blended Christianity with African religions and created voodoo. Sugar also affected culture through its food and drinks. Increased output went to supply rising demand. Sugar was consumed as part of three newly popular hot beverages: chocolate, coffee, and tea, and found its way into other foodstuffs as well. Cookbooks published throughout the 17th and 18th century increasingly featured recipes that depended on sugar, as well as multiplying kinds of preparations for sweets and confections and growing numbers of recipes for cakes, puddings, and other desserts. Regarding sugar, tension started between American colonies and Britain. The trade imbalance between the colonies and Britain led to middle and lower class people in America to be in constant debt. The reasoning for this was America was buying more than it was selling. Then, the Sugar Act was put into place by the Great Britain Parliament in 1764. This raised the tax on sugar for the British colonies. The colonists felt they weren't being represented and that goods like sugar shouldn't be taxed when they had no voice in the matter. Sugar impacted later events such as the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre. Since tensions kept rising between the Americans and the British, colonists finally started taking action. Britain had a big demand for sugar since it became a necessity for most people in Great Britain. They also loved tea, and if they had tea, they also needed sugar to go with it. A domino effect started to happen after the taxes were placed on goods such as sugar and tea. This is when the Boston Massacre occurred. The product of it was the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party was when American colonists went on board a British trading ship and threw out chests of tea into the Boston harbor. As time went on, slave trade overseas eventually became illegal, but that didn't stop the plantation owners from tirelessly working the aggregation of slaves they still had ownership of. Now today, sugar can be found anywhere and everywhere. As you can see from the chart, world sugar consumption has grown rapidly over the course of the last few centuries. From the 17th to the 18th century alone, sugar consumption per year more than doubled worldwide. To put this in perspective, statistics indicate that only 200 years ago, the average American ate only 2 pounds of sugar per year. That number rose to 123 and 142 pounds per year by 1970, and the mid-2000s, respectively, says Carla D. Martin. Sugar may be beneficial in the industry, but even today, sugar shows its negative impacts on society. Sugar plays a big factor in obesity today, and too much of it can lead to negative side effects, such as tooth decay, high blood sugar, and weight gain. Despite sugar's sweet and rich flavor, the history of sugar in America will always leave a bitter aftertaste.